good to see you this morning.
Good to be with you, Marcia.
David McNaughton, ambassador to Washington during the Trump era, and Louise Blais, the former ambassador to the UN, going public with their comments about Trudeau, talking about Trump, fearing it could lead to retribution if he becomes president again. What do you make of this?
Well, let's start with the top line, which is it's quite surprising to see former top-level diplomats giving advice to the prime minister. It's, they're not elected officials, they're not adversaries, they're not on his team, and yet they're weighing in on these big issues. They're basing themselves, obviously, on their deep experience in international affairs and saying, be careful, especially McNaughton, who's, always had the ear of Trudeau, and he was quite cordial in his approach, but quite direct, saying, stop using Trump's name as a swear word against your political opponent, Pierre Poilievre. Well, I think that was to underestimate the willfulness of Justin Trudeau, because as we saw yesterday at question period, he went straight at Poilievre, as Poilievre was saying, oh, things used to be better and things were better before you were here. And Trudeau just stand up and delivered a killer line to Poilievre. So what he's saying is, let's make Canada great again. Just an absolute take on Trump's key line of MAGA, make America great again. So this is the Trudeau that I got to know quite personally during our election campaign. He listens to the advice of those closest to him, but he doesn't back down when he thinks that there's an issue that has to be talked about. And this is what we're seeing here. Is there going to be a price to pay for it if indeed Trump does come in? Probably. But I don't see how Trump's view of Trudeau could have gotten much worse. We all remember, I'm sure you do, Marcia, when the G7 meeting was held in Quebec and Mr. Trump was back on Air Force One ready to leave, and Mr. Trudeau took a shot at him in front of the microphones. And Trump, unfortunately, was not off the ground and had watched it and delivered a blistering attack on Trudeau. So their personal relationship is not great. But I think that Trudeau is simply making the following bet, that the more he can tie Pierre Poilievre to the MAGAs, to the Trumps, to that whole movement in the United States, and there's lots of possibilities to do that, the more Canadians are going to give second thoughts to ever voting for Pierre Poilievre. I think that that's his big bet.
But what about during this time of very real concerns about election interference? The Prime Minister could be seen as someone who is trying to interfere with the U.S. election process, Tom.
I think that we'd be getting a bit ahead of ourselves if we thought that anything that we say up here is actually going to interfere in a U.S. election, because it's very overt. It's simply saying that Mr. Trudeau's principal opponent here, Mr. Poilievre, is someone who is on certain issues. I think Ukraine can fairly be put into that pot. And the Conservatives always push back and say, no, we have our own reasons. It's the carbon tax part of that trade deal with Ukraine. But it is worth noting that the Republicans in the United States are backing away from supporting Ukraine, despite the illegal war being prosecuted by the Russian Federation against this independent country. And it's galling to see the Conservatives come up with any sort of excuse, carbon tax or anything else, to say that they're going to vote against a trade deal that Ukraine is asking for. So they basically had to invent this whole thing, because that carbon tax had been in place for well over a decade there. It's part of the European groundwork that has been done on environment, and Ukraine wants to join the European Union, and this is part of what they have to do. Nothing unusual about a trade deal talking about environment, and yet Poilievre has convinced himself that he can use this as an excuse not to back Ukraine, because that's what he's doing. He's failing to back Ukraine. A lot of Ukrainian Canadians, Marcia, you know the numbers, well over 1 million. They're, with Ukrainian background, they're going to be quite upset with the Conservatives. I think it might start to show in their numbers. Trudeau's playing at hardball, right back at Poilievre, who loves playing hardball.
And I have to ask you, lastly, our friend Nick Nanos has been busy. His latest polling shows Conservatives still do have a commanding lead over the Liberals. And it looks like the Prime Minister could be at risk of losing ground in Vancouver and Toronto. Tom, what would that mean for the Liberals?
Those would be the two places I would expect them to be in the greatest danger right away. The Liberals pulled off a minor miracle in the Greater Toronto area in the last election. Looked like the NDP had numbers to take a whole bunch of seats. They got nothing. And the Liberals continued to dominate. So keep an eye on Jagmeet Singh, who's already starting to saber rattle a little bit, saying he might walk away from the deal. Would the Bloc ever vote against the budget and bring down the government? I'm not convinced that it would be in their interest to do that, but keep an eye on it. But Nanos is right. I mean, Vancouver and Toronto are going to be the key areas. Trudeau's pretty safe in Montreal, especially thanks to the fact that there's a fairly large English-speaking population there that feels hard pressed and squeezed by the Bloc and not big fans of Poilievre. But, Quebec voters can surprise as well, because there's often a movement en masse during an election. We benefited from it with the orange wave of 2011 in the NDP. So I do think that there's real concern amongst the Liberals. Mr. Trudeau himself, I sense, is giving himself until June, until the end of the spring session. If the numbers remain like that, there's very little runway left for him to have any chance of defeating Poilievre. And I think that he might step down and call a leadership review. Maybe that would give some new energy and a bit of a honeymoon to the Liberal Party that's looking a little bit long in the tooth, well into the 9th year of Justin Trudeau.
Okay, we're going to timestamp your prediction. Tom, thanks a lot. Good to see you this morning.
All the best, Marcia.
You
Good
too.
to be with you.